Introduced in 1980 to a buying public that wanted much more fuel-efficient vehicles, General Motors X cars, the Chevrolet Citation, Pontiac Phoenix is shown here, Oldsmobile Omega, and Buick Skylark were a big hit in terms of sales in their first model year. More specifically, Chevrolet sold over 800,000 Citations in 1980 alone, and 1.4 million of these X cars across all variants were sold in the 1980 model year. It was an unquestionable success for General Motors and a huge feather in the cap for a design and engineering team that looked to do something different and something that General Motors had never done before. Prior to this point, General Motors was largely just refining variations of vehicles that it had produced for many years, namely front-engine, rear-wheel drive, intermediate, and full-size cars. There were, of course, some technological innovations along the way and cars that didn't quite fit that mold, including the Corvair and the Tornado and Eldorado, but by and large, what GM was producing fit into that formula. When the X cars were introduced, GM had to rip up its entire playbook, and this was in part an issue, and one of the reasons why the cars had numerous teething challenges was that GM had never engineered anything like this before. But the X cars, as flawed as they were seminal vehicles in American automotive history, being the first transversely mounted engine and transmission front-wheel drive vehicles made by domestic auto companies. There were, of course, other manufacturers who employed similar techniques in making front drivers, including Volkswagen as well as Lancia overseas. But GM, Ford, and Chrysler had not yet tried this formula, although it would be one that would soon reshape the auto industry for many years to come. Let's now talk about 10 facts that you probably don't know about this General Motors X car. We'll start off with number 10, which was that this was really the first car where aerodynamics were a huge focal element for designers as well as engineers. Up until this point, General Motors stylists and engineers really didn't do much wind tunnel work, as it wasn't something that was necessarily worth considering when gas was very cheap and designers wanted to make a car simply look the best that it could, as opposed to one that could slice through the air and consequently save fuel economy and potentially look good doing so. The X cars changed all that, and really, as I said, were the first vehicles where General Motors did a lot of work in the wind tunnel in order to get and perfect the styling and shape of the vehicle to ensure that it was aerodynamic. GM had not yet built its own wind tunnel on its tech center campus and consequently had to rent out Lockheed's wind tunnel in order to test clay models of the X cars. Various clay models revealed a number of changes that had to be made to the models to make them more aerodynamic. One of which was the overall mirror shape, and the second was that the car could not meet the necessary cooling criteria with the typical grille and front end that designers wanted. In fact, designers ended up removing the entire grille from the vehicle because they couldn't quite figure out why they weren't getting enough airflow through the radiator and supposed that it was, in fact, a function of the grille blocking the air. When this open-grilled clay model also didn't perform well in the cooling tests, designers now understood that there just simply wasn't enough room between the radiator and the engine to get the required airflow, and consequently the front end overhang of the vehicle was made larger to place the radiator much more ahead of the engine and allow airflow to enter the radiator and exit on the backside of it as well. Designers also found that sloping the nose and the front end of these vehicles often improved the aerodynamic drag coefficient, and so you'll notice that a number of the X cars do have that kind of sloped nose front end. The pure fastback designs with their relatively high rear were also quite aerodynamic, so that design really matured quite well as the wind tunnel testing went on. All in all, some of the things that designers learned in the wind tunnel testing were certainly incorporated into the overall design. However, GM had to have its wonderful 76 to 79 Seville notchback style styling on the final vehicles, and consequently many of the X-car variants, at least the 2- and 4-door notchbacks, displayed some traits that wouldn't be ideal for aerodynamic shape, but still were good overall, especially for the time. And the hatchback cars, that some of the divisions had were really quite good in the wind tunnel overall. Let's now move on to number 9, which is challenging serviceability on these X cars. Many American vehicles to this point had been quite easy to service. It was easy to locate the distributor and change the distributor cap and rotor, easy to access the spark plugs and spark plug wires, the oil filters. All of those main items were not hard to change on a typical front-engine rear-wheel drive car. However, rotating that engine by 90 degrees and putting it transversely in a much smaller package created some challenging serviceability items on these vehicles, most notably for the base 4-cylinder engine configuration, which was originally designed to fit into Chevrolet Vegas and Pontiac Astras in a north-south configuration. As a consequence, on these 2.5-liter Iron Duke engines, there are a number of typical service items that actually are pretty hard to change, at least relative to what they would be on other vehicles of the time. More specifically, the oil filter location on these X cars and the 2.5 4-cylinders is far from ideal. You have to really wiggle around and reach up in some cases through the wheelhouse to get that oil filter off because it's on the backside of the engine in an inconvenient location. Another super challenging service item is the distributor cap and rotor, which are also located on the backside of the engine. You can't get them from underneath because the power steering rack blocks your view as well as the ability to get your hands up there to work on them. And you can't easily access it from the top side either because it's tucked right behind the firewall. The best way to service those is to undo the front dog bone motor mount, rock the engine forward a bit, and that helps you access the distributor cap. Of course, these vehicles also were GM's first, not the first in the industry, but GM's first to employ McPherson struts up front with shocks that were interior to coil springs. This meant that in order to service the strut, especially in the days before they had quick struts, where it was a lot easier just to replace the whole assembly, you had to remove the strut, decompress the spring, change out the shock that was interior to it or the strut that was interior to it, and then reassemble the whole thing and put it back on the car. Something that was much more challenging than changing out a shock, for example, on a front-engine rear-wheel drive car. So these X cars do have challenging serviceability, at least, again, relative to what customers were used to. On the V6 engines, the back spark plugs were also not all that easy. And again, sometimes it helps to just undo one of the motor mounts and give yourself a little bit more room. Next, let's move on to number 8, which is that the mule cars, or the engineering test vehicles for these Citations, were based largely on Lancia Betas and Volkswagen Passats, known as the Dasher in the U.S. As I mentioned before, while the X cars were General Motors' first foray into this transversely mounted engine and transmission front-wheel drive vehicle space, that was not true internationally, where a number of automakers had already tried this concept and had quite a bit of success with it. Thus, in order to conjure up some engineering test mules, General Motors purchased quite a few Volkswagen Dashers, which had been introduced into the United States for the 1974 model year, and displayed very similar engineering to what General Motors was aspiring to on the X car, as well as some Lancia Betas, which were manufactured in Italy from 1972 to 1984. And unlike the Dasher, these Lancias did have transversely mounted engine and transmissions driving the front wheels. Doing so enabled General Motors engineers to try a number of different configurations and test the vehicles to see how they would behave. Perhaps then it's no coincidence that the Chevrolet Citation and Pontiac Phoenix hatchbacks bear arguably more than a passing resemblance to the Lancia Beta. Regardless, it was these test mules that really helped General Motors engineers put the X car through its paces. And again, they were not based on any domestic vehicles, but instead VW Dashers and Lancia Betas. Let's move on to number 7, which is that these X cars introduced a number of strange and new engineering items to the buying public. Now, as I mentioned, these cars did have a number of teething problems, and one might say, well, why on earth would General Motors let vehicles out that had those? We have to remember, as I mentioned, for many years, General Motors was simply refining variants of a tried and true automotive engineering philosophy that it had been executing for many years in the marketplace. And when you refine a design continuously, you often know how components and parts are going to behave over time. But when you rip everything up and have to do everything fresh and anew, Despite your best efforts in testing, you really just don't know how some of the components are going to prove out in the marketplace and when they'll fail. As an example, GM certainly cycled its window tape drive regulators through many, many cycles on the test stands. However, those cycles cannot basically match what happens to those tape regulators over time and years of lots of thermal cycling going through winters as well as summers, and in which case the plastic becomes more brittle and they're more prone to crack. Those are things that you learn over the years and then you make refinements to the design, but GM didn't have that opportunity here with these X cars. That said, the X cars did introduce, as I mentioned, a number of strange and new engineering items, one of which was the rear stabilizer bar that was conveniently tucked into the rear axle, a great way to really disguise this item from underneath, and was very effective in providing good handling for these vehicles. The second were these tape drive window regulators that GM introduced in the 1980 X cars, and a similar level of engineering was used in the B bodies when they went through their revision in 1980 and got rid of the more traditional window regulators that were much more robust, shall we say. In the X cars, GM also developed a very strange bucket-style front bench seat. It looks like these buckets would move individually, but they don't. They're actually connected, and this is a bench seat, and both seat backs as well as the center console there move back and forth as a bench. I think that's pretty strange. Just looking at it, you would never anticipate that's a bench. Also, for whatever reason, and if somebody knows, please comment, the window cranks on these X cars turned in an opposite direction from how they normally would on a GM car. In other words, you turn the crank clockwise for the window to go up and counterclockwise for the window to go down, the exact opposite of pretty much every other vehicle to that point. Lastly, the X cars would also have the first use for General Motors of an electric cooling fan. By this point, GM really hadn't had a need to introduce that technology because the engines were in a north-south configuration and it could just power the cooling fan off of the engine. But rotating that engine 90 degrees necessitated something different, and the electric cooling fan also helped save fuel economy. So a number of new engineering items were introduced on these vehicles, and a lot more beyond that. All of the door hardware was new. All of the door hinge hardware was new. The brake systems were new. The engines as well as the transmissions were generally new, except for the 2.5-liter four-cylinder. The 2.8-liter V6 was all new. The McPherson strut front suspension was new. The rear axle suspension was new. I could go on and on and on. And consequently, there was just so much new on these vehicles that it led to some teething problems, unfortunately, that ended up catching up with the car, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. Let's move on to number 6, which is strange gas powertrains that were under hood in these vehicles or going to be under hood in these vehicles. When the X car was originally planned, there was going to be a choice of 2 4-cylinders for the base engine, not just the Pontiac 2.5-liter Iron Duke inline 4-cylinder, but also a variant of the previous Vega 2.3-liter 4-cylinder. By this point, GM had felt that it had improved the Vega's 2.3-liter 4-cylinder to be quite reliable, and it was certainly much better now that it was the Durabuilt 2300 compared to the engine that was introduced in the Vega originally. But the Pontiac 2.5-liter 4-cylinder was, in truth, a much better and more conventional engine, and thankfully, Pontiac convinced GM and the planning group overall to just have one base engine, the Pontiac 2.5, and sunset the Chevrolet Vega's engine. Pontiac had to add additional capacity because there wasn't enough capacity to make enough 2.5-liter 4-cylinders to go around, but that was a small price to pay, and many of the engineers were happy that the Vega's 4-cylinder was put out to pasture. The X car also introduced the new Chevrolet engineered 2.8-liter 60-degree V6, which actually was a pretty pleasant engine, aside from some funky carburetor issues that most every car had during this period because auto companies were trying to meet really tough emission standards. But strangely, this Chevrolet 2.8 actually spawned the 1.8-liter 4-cylinder that was employed in the J car, which shared its valve train and pistons and many components with that Chevrolet 2.8-liter V6. So GM actually got a 2-for-1 almost in terms of that J car engine. What's not generally known beyond what I just mentioned is that there were a couple other engine variants that were planned for the X cars, one of which was a potential 60-degree V4 engine that was based on that Chevrolet 2.8-liter V6. So imagine you could have a V4 as well as a V6, and you just basically lop off 2 cylinders from that V6. At the end of the day, that V4 was not selected, largely because of cost reasons. You have a V engine versus an inline. You have 2 cylinder heads, 2 exhaust manifolds, and it's more challenging to tune as well because you have 2 different exhausts. And again, the Pontiac 2.5 was selected as the base engine. Overall, the engines themselves were not horrible in the X cars, but they certainly weren't world-class when you stuck them up against the Japanese competitors, for example. Although the little 2.8 V6 was a pretty good engine, peppy and relatively smooth. Next, let's talk about an engine variant that many don't know about, and that was that the X cars were actually going to potentially have an Oldsmobile-engineered V5 diesel engine. Yes, I said that right, V5 diesel. Remember, this was a time period when Oldsmobile was leaning heavily into diesel as well as General Motors because it was thought to be an effective way to get higher fuel economy in a time when that was needed. Well, Oldsmobile introduced this 350 cubic inch diesel V8 in 1978 and really had a number of challenges associated with it. Everything from injector pumps to cylinder head gaskets that would blow because the head bolts would stretch. And, well, let's just say a number of issues. People didn't necessarily like the stinkiness and the soot and the smell. They did like the fuel economy generally. And consequently, by this point in time, when the X cars were originally being planned, GM thought it might be good to put a diesel in these vehicles and was looking at this Oldsmobile V5 diesel to put under hood. Oldsmobile would eventually engineer a 4.3-liter V6 diesel to go under hood in the A bodies as well as the C body cars. But the entire diesel program was eventually killed for the 1985 model year, or at least killed after, I should say, the 1985 model year. By that point, diesel fuel prices had spiked, gasoline prices had gone down, and the original owners of the 350 cubic inch diesels really had just said so many bad things about them that people didn't want to buy diesels. So the V5 diesel really never made it into the X car, but it certainly was something that was being considered, as you see here, a working and running prototype of this Oldsmobile V5 diesel. The V5 would have also allowed for very nice packaging because you could put a bunch of accessories in that space where one cylinder was missing. Now, I don't know what it would have sounded like, and I would pay money to hear this engine run, and I would also guess that it wasn't a smooth engine, but it certainly was kind of cool. Next, let's go on to number 4, and that is that the X car was originally supposed to spawn a Cadillac Simron variant. Many know the Simron is the universal punching bag for General Motors badge engineering and for Cadillac in general. What most people don't talk about is the car was actually quite a good vehicle, at least in its latter years, and now owning one, I can say it's super fun to drive, especially with the V6 under hood. But the original plan for the Cimarron was not to be based on the J car, the Cavalier, the 2000, the Olds Forenza, and the Buick Skylark, but actually to be based on the X car. Imagine if the Cimarron had been on the somewhat larger platform. At least in that case, it would have had 3 more inches in width and would have had 5 more inches in wheelbase and maybe been a much better success. The problem was that there simply was no production capacity in the plants that were making the X cars to fit the Cadillac Cimarron in, because Cadillac was a late entry in terms of wanting a small car. They were so late, in fact, that the designers and engineers only had about 6 months to re-engineer the J-car platform to make it a Cadillac, and they consequently couldn't do much. Designers effectively were able to change the grille, the wheels, and some elements of the interior, but that was it. That's all you can do in new vehicles if you only have about 6 months to do them. So that's what they ended up with. But imagine, what do you think this Cadillac Simron would have become if it were an X car? Let me know in the comments if you think it would have been more successful. I think it would have, and it probably would have even looked a little bit better than the J car that it ended up being based on. Let's move on to number 3, and that is about a particular person who was involved in the Cimarron, and that's a gentleman by the name of Bob Eaton. If that name sounds familiar, it's because Bob Eaton is the individual who later rose to be chairman of Chrysler and ended up engineering the merger of Chrysler with Daimler-Benz and forming Daimler-Chrysler in the late 1990s. But many years before he would become the chairman of Chrysler, Bob Eaton was actually the chief engineer of these X cars for General Motors. And he gained a reputation for being quite unflappable, particularly in depositions that arose associated with the X car's braking system. This helped catapult him to fame despite the fact that there were a number of engineering flaws with the vehicle, and he would subsequently become chairman of General Motors of Europe, which is where Chrysler would poach him in becoming the next chief executive officer for Chrysler, as well as eventually the chairman once Lee Iacocca retired. This is an interesting turn of events in automotive history, as many Chrysler fanatics and Mopar fans would have much preferred Bob Lutz to have gotten the job as the top dog at Chrysler, but unfortunately he was passed over for Bob Eaton, in part because of Lee Iacocca's desire to have a successor who was not Bob Lutz. But back at this point in his career history, Bob Eaton was the chief engineer of the X car, and Bob Stempel, later chairman and CEO of General Motors, was Chevrolet's chief engineer, so the chief engineer for all of the division. So a number of famous people worked on this vehicle and catapulted them to success despite the challenges associated with the car. At number 2, let's talk about one of the most unfortunate elements of the X car, and that is that it actually had a minivan variant, which General Motors killed. And of course, some other company, namely Chrysler, picked up and ran away with and had tremendous success. Many engineers and designers who worked on the X car thought a minivan variant was the perfect vehicle for a number of individuals to use to transport their families with relatively compact size and tons of space on the inside. But General Motors management, perhaps myopically, thought that this minivan variant would impinge upon very profitable station wagon sales, and they consequently decided to kill that particular variant as the X cars were released for production. It's unfortunate because GM could have had clearly a product winner on their hands and beaten Chrysler to market. By the way, Ford also killed a minivan variant for similar reasons, and it was a bunch of ex-Ford people, namely Hal Sperlich and Lee Iacocca, who would come to Chrysler to launch the minivan, and that was how Chrysler ended up with that particular product. But it was one of the planned variants for the X car that never made it to production. Last, on number 1, we have that the X car was the most recalled car in history to that point. Prior to that point, the Aspen and Volare held the title as the most recalled car in history, with all sorts of issues that unfortunately fell upon them, including issues with the torsion bar front suspension, stalling, which was the most typical issue that a lot of these cars had, but the X car topped all of them, and mostly because of its braking system. The cars, especially the early model years, had a tendency to lock the rear wheels upon even moderate braking, and GM would eventually have to fight the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, or NHTSA, both in court and in the court of public opinion when it came to these recalls. While GM eventually prevailed in a number of cases, at least from a legal standpoint, it didn't necessarily prevail from a public opinion standpoint. And this was really demonstrated in the sales figures of the X cars. As I mentioned, in 1980, 1.4 million X cars were sold, but that was the peak year for the X vehicles. And every year thereafter, the sales dwindled and dwindled and dwindled to the point that in just a few years they were selling roughly half that volume, and it only went down from there. The X cars had so many different teething issues, everything from the brakes that I mentioned before to steering racks that had morning sickness issues or issues with the wheels turning, to hardware challenges, mostly window regulators, in some cases door latches, to suspension issues, to transmission issues where the transmissions would fail prematurely, to carburation issues, including lean mixtures, particularly on manual transmission vehicles, that they really just didn't live up to the public's expectations, and it was unfortunate. Driving an X car now, I will say you really appreciate how much GM got right with these vehicles. The ride is quite good. The road noise is quite low and the wind noise is quite low. The packaging on the inside of the cars is a 10 out of 10 when it comes to overall space and spaciousness. The seat comfort is a 10 out of 10. The stereos are great. The HVAC systems are great. So there was a lot that was right, but there just were so many challenges associated with it. And consequently, the X-Car sales really started to falter. Chevrolet, interestingly, would try to reinvigorate the X-Car sales by introducing the Citation 2 in 1984, hoping that 2, the Roman numeral 2, was going to help with sales and help kind of rebrand the car. Of course, it didn't. And all the X-Car variants were gone by the 1985 model year, although the components did live on, mostly in the A-bodies, which were the X-Car spiritual successors, even carrying the same wheelbase. And they lived on for many years into the mid-1990s. So the X-Car did prove successful, but perhaps just in a little bit different form, namely the A-body form, the Chevrolet Celebrity, Pontiac 6000, Olds Cutlass Sierra, and Buick Century, versus its original X-Car form. Hope you enjoyed this special on the top things that you did not know about the X-Cars. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you. Thanks again for watching.